of a prison inmate doing life who risks everything to become an attorney. Here on BBC Two now, all eyes are on Dudley West as David Dimbleby introduces tonight's by-election special.
Within the next hour, we'll know whether the voters of Dudley West have just embarrassed or have seriously damaged John Major and the Conservative Party. We'll be discussing the result with politicians of the major parties. We'll be hearing from the voters of Dudley West why they voted as they did. But first, the midnight news now from Sarah Spiller.
Good evening. The polls closed 2 hours ago in the Dudley West by-election. The turnout was 47%. That compares with an 82% turnout at the last general election. The count is well underway and the declaration is expected within the next hour. The election was caused by the death of the Conservative MP, Dr. John Blackburn, who had a majority of nearly 6,000 at the last general election. And there'll be a full analysis of the result in breakfast news, starting at 7 o'clock on BBC One. In 2 hours' time, President Clinton will call for a $60 billion tax cut designed to help Americans with child rearing, college tuition and home buying. The scheme will be paid for by a major government restructuring and a freeze on spending.
So President Clinton is back on the tax-cutting bandwagon, hoping tonight's speech can resuscitate his comatose presidency. Even friends suggest if it doesn't work, the Clinton years are effectively over.
For while Bill Clinton has the mind of a new Democrat, he retains the heart of an old Democrat.
Tax cut fever has infected both political parties in Washington, but unless the deficit is again going to balloon out of control, the politicians are going to have to come up with spending cuts as well. And at that point, Santa Claus can begin to look like Scrooge. Gavin ESLER, BBC News at the White House.
Ireland's new Prime Minister has said his top priority will be to continue the peace process in Northern Ireland. John Bruton's election comes after a month of political turmoil in Dublin, following the collapse of the previous coalition government led by Albert Reynolds. Later today, Mr Bruton will meet Gerry Adams at a session of the Irish government's National Peace Forum. President Yeltsin has given rebels in the breakaway region of Chechnya another 48 hours to surrender their weapons. The rebels' leader has called for high-level talks to try to end the crisis.
Despite their considerable size and sophistication, the Russian army units have been blocked by ranks of unarmed Chechens on the approaches to Grozny. Mines lace the road, deterring tank commanders from proceeding. Skirmishes continue in the villages surrounding the capital. The Chechens, though, remain defiant. Their resolve has perhaps caused President Yeltsin to consider the implications of an invasion of Grozny more carefully, with the apparent reluctance of his troops to continue with the operation. But then again, his extension of the deadline may be a maneuver to give his troops more time to consolidate their positions.
Large differences in the clinical performance of NHS trusts in Scotland will be disclosed in official figures due to be released later today. The figures, which include deaths and readmission rates, will show that in some hospitals, heart patients are nearly twice as likely to die than in others. But officials are stressing that the figures need to be treated with caution.
Today's figures will reveal some large and unexplained differences between the performance of individual hospitals. For the first time, patients and doctors in Scotland will see the death rates for heart and stroke patients, as well as other indicators, such as how many medical patients have to be readmitted.
How are you feeling now?
The figures will show that heart attack victims have a much better chance of surviving in some Scottish hospitals rather than others. But this may be because the hospital receives less sick patients. It could also be because ambulances are quicker at getting them there, or that staff are quicker at administering clot-busting drugs.
Granada Television has been fined £500,000 for plugging commercial products on its weekday programme this morning. The Independent Television Commission said the programme repeatedly broke industry rules on sponsorship. This latest infringement was the programme's 8th in 2 years. Sports news now, and the Aga Khan has announced he's to race his horses in Britain again next year following a 4-year absence. He's already entered 24 horses for the 1996 Derby, all of which are likely to be trained at Newmarket. The Aga Khan pulled out of British racing in protest 4 years ago when his horse Ali Isel was disqualified after failing a dope test. But the Aga Khan has decided to bury his differences following the Jockey Club's announcement of changes to the dope testing procedures. The South African golfer Ernie Els is the early leader after the first round of the Johnny Walker World Championship in Jamaica. Els, the world number 3, shot a 7-under par 64 and heads the 17-strong field by 3 strokes. Among 3 players who scored 67 on the opening day of the tournament were Nick Faldo and here, Scotland's Colin Montgomery. Now a look at the markets. The FTSE closed down 7 points at 29.73. And in New York, the Dow ended up 19 points at 37.65. Against the dollar, the pound was down just a fraction at 1.56.1. And against the German mark, the pound was also down a little at 2 marks 45.4. That's the news. Now back to David Dimbleby in the by-election studio.
And that was Sarah Spiller with the news, and as she rightly said, there'll be analysis on breakfast time, but I'm glad to say there'll be some analysis in the early hours here on BBC 2 Now of this Dudley West by-election. That's what we're here for. The Tories surrendered 7 seats in by-elections in the last Parliament. They won them all back again at the general election. So a heavy defeat tonight at the hands of Labour doesn't necessarily mean all is lost for the Conservative Party by any means. But if, on the other hand, support for the government is seen to be hemorrhaging, could spell serious trouble for John Major, just as he tries to reunite the party after the split over Europe and after the defeat on the full whack of VAT being put on domestic fuel. So tonight we are going to be looking carefully at the Dudley West result to try to see what can be learnt from it. This critical West Midlands seat, the kind that switched allegiance to bring Mrs. Thatcher into office in 1979. It was held with comfortable majorities right through the 80s by John Blackburn, whose death, of course, caused this by-election. To help us here to analyse it, Robin Oakley, the BBC's political editor, is here. And alongside him, political analyst Peter Kellner to comment on the significance of the figures that we'll be getting. And Peter Snow will chart the rise and fall of political fortunes as the government struggles to remain master of events.
Yes, well, we'll be looking hard at the Dudley by-election result to see what's happened to party support. And also our swingometer will help us to follow the switch of allegiance between the 2 main parties since the last general election. How many of these blue Conservative figures can Labour turn to red in the next general election, which may not be that far away? And will Labour be able to match the kind of 12% swing they got in the European election 6 months ago in the general election? Or will the Tories recover between now and then?
Thank you very much, Peter. We're also joined by 3 politicians: Stephen Dorrell, who draws the short straw, the Conservative Heritage Secretary; John Prescott, Labour's Deputy Leader, who's been smiling all evening; and Nick Harvey, the Liberal Democrats Trade and Industry Spokesman, who's incidentally also just been installed as Chairman of the Liberal Democrats Campaign Committee, people in charge of their campaign. And at Dudley West, at the Count, our own Steve Richards to tell us about the state of play so far. Steve, what do you have for us at the moment?
Well, David, first of all, we can tell you what the turnout has been here. It's been around 47.3%, which is fairly low, but Labour are pointing out that it's not bad for a December by-election so near to Christmas. They say it's fairly typical. In fact, I was speaking to one of the Labour candidates, Minders, who said, well, if in Enfield they got 50.6% when Michael Portillo won a by-election in December some time ago, if we come around there, that would be fairly typical. Well, they didn't make that, but the turnout's there. But Labour have obviously
just before
won.
you leave that point, are the Tories taking comfort from a low turnout, saying it means our people may not have voted Labour but have stayed at home?
Absolutely. You've guessed the line you're going to hear from them when we get the result, David. They're already saying, look, we're going to lose tonight, but a lot of our supporters just haven't turned out. They haven't rushed to embrace New Labour, as Labour are now calling themselves quite often. They've stayed at home instead. So that's going to be the Tory line. Whether it will hold will partly depend, I guess, on the scale of their defeat, because Labour are saying that those who did go out to vote have voted for them in big numbers. They're saying they could get about 66% of the vote here today.
And what's your impression been of the way the voting's been going? You've been out and about talking to people as they come out of the exit poll?
Well,
I shouldn't say expert, come out of the polling booth.
Absolutely. Well, I think there are 2 points. First of all, the low turnout is interesting. There hasn't been a great deal of interest in this campaign. It could be put down partly to the proximity towards Christmas, but it has been a fairly low-key campaign. Labour have done a lot more than the Conservatives or Liberal Democrats, but have largely confined themselves to photo opportunities and early morning news conferences, rather than have held any rallies and gone out a great deal to meet the voters. And push their own point of view. What they've done, and done well, is exploited the huge disillusionment that is here with the government itself. And all the people, and it's a lot of areas here are traditional Tory territory, are saying to me and to others that they're deeply disillusioned with this government. And that has been the theme of the by-election, rather than the big enthusiastic embrace of Labour.
OK, Stephen, what do you know about when we're going to get the result? How far have they got in the
Within
counting?
the hour, David. They're counting away here quite fast. The low turnout obviously means we won't have to wait that long. They're saying before 1 o'clock.
Fine, thanks so much indeed. We'll be back to you. Peter, let's have a look at Dudley West and where it stands in the charts.
Right, David. Now, this is a relatively prosperous seat in the West Midlands, the kind of seat the Tories in normal times should be winning, just west of Birmingham. There it is, right in the middle of our map there. And here's what happened in the April '92 election, held by the Conservatives throughout Mrs Thatcher's and Mr Major's administrations. John Blackburn with 34,700 odd votes in the last election in '92. There's Labour and the Liberal Democrats quite a way behind, but not that far behind. The Labour Party 5,789 behind, meaning that when you look at the share of the vote in Dudley, you can see what an absolutely vital marginal this is for the Labour Party. There they are, 8% behind, 49 to 41 in the last general election. They need a 4% swing, just subtract one from the other, you get 8, halve it, you get 4, a 4% swing to take this seat. And it just happens that that 4% is exactly what Labour need to get a majority of 1 in the next general election. So Dudley is an absolutely prime target for Labour. They want to win it, of course, dramatically in a by-election to be sure of winning a general election. Lib Dems, no hopers there, down to 10% in the general election last time. Not a seat for them. A vital two-party marginal seat. Now, what's happened since the general election, since that 8% Conservative lead there in the general election, what's happened in the campaign so far? Well, all we have to go on, of course, are polls. Take them or leave them, but they do, whether you believe them or not, show huge switches in support from Conservative to Labour. The first poll, December the 3rd to the 8th, you can just see tucked away down there, NOP plus or minus 5%, so be very careful of these figures, but never mind, a huge gap. Labour up here, Tories down here, Lib Dems down the bottom. The second poll, a little bit later on, December 9th and 10th, there's the field work, that's when people will ask the question what they do in the by-election, 63% to 18%, a huge gap opening up here between Labour and the Conservatives. And the last poll, wow, 71%. This was a poll in the Birmingham Evening News, December 9th and 10th, a huge gap opening up here, and 11% the Liberal Democrats down the bottom there. So what you have here is a distance between Labour and Conservative that would, when you compare it with the general election, mean a swing to beat all records in a by-election, something like 32%, the best ever in the past is 27%, and down here you have a possibility here, if this poll is anywhere near right, of the Liberal Democrats perhaps taking second place from the Conservatives. David.
Peter, thanks so much. Well, Robin Oakley, let's just cut through the figures for a moment and go to the politics. The politicians keep saying, both parties in a way, by-elections are eccentric now. They're always treated as a way to bash the government. How significant is Dudley West likely to be?
Well, we're not going to get any surprise tonight with the Tories being defeated. They've now had a run of 10 consecutive seats they've defended in by-elections, all of which they've lost. They haven't actually held a seat at a by-election since Richmond back in 1989. So we're fully expecting a Conservative defeat tonight. But one thing that will be important, I think, is the margin of Labour's victory. This, after all, is the first by-election we've had for Labour under Tony Blair's leadership. All the publicity that we've had for New Labour, I think it'll be a key question as to whether Labour can achieve the kind of swings against the government in a seat where they start in a comfortable second place that the Liberal Democrats have been able to do earlier in this Parliament in 3 seats in Newbury and Christchurch. If the Labour can now get those sort of victory margins in seats like Dudley, then the government really are in deep trouble.
And what would you be looking for Labour to go to bed happy?
Well, Labour people have been telling me that they won't be happy with anything less than a 10,000 majority. I think a lot of them are secretly hoping for rather more than that, but the low turnout may be adjusting some of those calculations, I think. But significant perhaps that this is a seat, this is a vote coming up just a week after the government have had their troubles over a vote of confidence. The last time we had a vote a week after a vote of confidence was Christchurch in July 1993, when the Liberal Democrats got a swing of 35%. We'll be looking at the kind of swing that Labour can achieve in Dudley West.
Right. And Peter Kellner, from the Tories' point of view, what would count as a result that they could live with, rather than a result that would have them all raising the question again of whether John Major was the right person to lead the party, or whether they'd had any hope of the next election?
Picking up what Robin's just said, if it is a 10,000 Labour majority, which he says Labour would be happy with, I think I'd be happier on a 10,000 Labour majority actually to be a Conservative Party manager than Labour Party manager. Obviously, Labour will be pleased to have the MP. The Conservatives will be desperately unhappy with Parliament as it is to have an opposition rather than a government MP. But on the figures, a 10,000 Labour majority would imply a swing from Conservative to Labour actually slightly less than the swing that Labour achieved 5 years ago in mid-Staffordshire, middle of the last Parliament. Now, if Labour can't do as well as they did at mid-Staffordshire, given that after mid-Staffs, the Tories won that seat back and they went on to win the following general election, I think the Tories would be not pleased, but be relieved. I think on this turnout, now we know the turnout, I would say 15,000 is more the critical figure. About 15,000, then I think Labour really does have cause to cheer. The Tories really do have cause to grieve.
Just before we bring in the politicians, let's have a look at other by-elections that have been significant or have had an effect. And we keep hearing about mid-term blues and governments brushing off by-election defeats and all the rest of it. It's true that defectors often return to the fold of the general election, but some recent by-elections have had a long-term significance in their effect on politics for both government and the opposition.
Oswald O'Brien, Labour, 20,000.
Just over a decade ago, just before the '83 election, Labour's victory in Darlington helped save Michael Foot's battered leadership. It did the opposite for his party, binding it to an unpopular leader and a manifesto later famously described as the longest suicide note in history. In effect, Darlington heralded Labour's long night in opposition.
Sylvia Lloyd Hill is duly elected to represent...
The government, too, has learnt lessons at the hands of the electorate. In March 1990, Mrs. Thatcher was already in trouble over the poll tax and the state of the economy. Her leadership was further and perhaps fatally weakened when the voters of mid-Staffordshire, a previously rock-solid, safe Tory seat, delivered their verdict. Labour won with a 21% swing against the government, a post-war record. 8 months later, the Tories were hammered again when Labour held the Bradford North by-election. This result, a 15% swing to Labour, convinced many northern Tory backbenchers that Mrs. Thatcher was indeed an electoral liability. Only a fortnight later, she was challenged for the leadership by Michael Heseltine, and within weeks, enter John Major. Well, John Prescott, do you see this as a watershed by-election like those three, one that will really change the face of politics?
Well, I certainly hope so, but the low turnout suggests that it might not be very easy to predict that kind of prediction from it. We're certainly looking to do well, and it's the sort of seat that we wouldn't have expected to do, and we're looking forward to winning it.
If it has gone wrong for the Tories, it's interesting that this seat has gone wrong, because it's a reasonably prosperous area. People I talked to when I was up there said that work was picking up, and yet they all feel the Tory party is a shambles.
Well, I think that what's happened is that this by-election's been fought against an almost uniquely hostile political environment in terms not of the economy and the substance of what's going on in political life, but in terms of political perception. We've seen, obviously, Mr. Blair's honeymoon effect since his election as leader. That's helped Labour. We've seen on our side the combined effects of a defeat on VAT, the government's troubles on Europe, and all of that on top of the normal effect of mid-term blues for a government. So it's actually quite hard to think of a longer list that you could compile that would have the effect, a greater effect on a government's popularity mid-term.
But you seem to be describing what Kenneth Clarke would call a very large hole that you've dug for yourselves in life.
Well, I'm recounting a number of incidents in politics over the last 6 months, all of which have had the effect of increasing the government's difficulties, but none of which are in themselves either substantial in terms of people's living standards and the votes they're likely to cast in a general election, nor, in fact, are they insoluble problems, and indeed some of them are problems that are now past and unlikely to recur.
Mike Hadley, what about the Liberal Democrats in this constituency? Because they should, I mean, in other parts of the country, they tend to do rather well, like the three by-elections we were talking about in this Parliament before, but tonight it's thought you've been squeezed out altogether. I don't know whether it's true or not.
Well, Dudley West is not a good wicket for us to be playing on, and I think what we'll be looking to see is how our performance here is compared with, for example, Labour's performance in seats like Christchurch. The voters have shown that they will tend to vote for the seat, the party that was second placed in the seat at the previous election. And in the case of Christchurch, we started from a weaker second place than Labour is starting from here, and Labour were in a stronger third place than we were. So we'll be seeing whether we have avoided the sort of squeeze that Labour experienced in Newbury and Christchurch, where if you added their vote together at the two elections, you wouldn't have saved one deposit. So if we managed to save one in one seat, we'll have done relatively rather better than they did.
John Prescott, did you pick up, when you were there, the things that Stephen Dorrell was talking about, which was there's a lot of disaffection with the Tories, but no particular policy that Labour was putting forward that people were keen to latch onto as a way of saving the economy or justifying voting Labour?
Well, it's certainly the feeling in that constituency areas about the government's handling of the economy. It's the one area that governments win elections on, and they were certainly very angry about the value-added tax increase. And all those, and of course we made very clear to them that this government had chosen that course of action. Even on value-added tax, if you look at that, they were angry enough about that, but happy that they'd been defeated in the House of Commons, which has the same kind of ring about the poll tax in the mid-staffs election. But what they were also angry about was the extra taxes that came on prices of cigarettes and beer. They felt that was a bit of viciousness by the government at the same time, having lost the tax, and they were paying the price for it.
But that isn't saying Labour's got policies which we want, is it? That's saying the Tories are making
well, they were clearly making, yes, I mean, when we had our meetings with them, there's no doubt about it, they preferred the alternatives that Labour put forward. But every opposition is going to say that, and indeed we have to win this election, not on the unpopularity of government, but actually on the alternatives. And we actually fought to campaign on that. We had something like 2 or 3 times the amounts of shadow cabinet people went up to this election, each of them doing their own areas of policy and putting it across.
But the interesting thing it was that even on those carefully stage-managed photo opportunities where Tony Blair met former disenchanted Tory voters, when those people were asked after the leader of the opposition had gone what there was in Labour's programme that they agreed with and found attractive, they could none of them actually name anything. The government's unpopular. That's blindingly obvious. What people haven't done, in the words of your correspondent, Steve Richards, is to embrace Labour.
But why didn't you send anybody up to fight the corner? I mean, Labour had everybody up there. You had virtually nobody up there. Briefly, the Home Secretary.
I could take that personally. I went up there, and Virginia Bottomley went up there. David Hunt went up there. So there was a range of 5. Well, that's 4 members of the cabinet. And there was a succession of people went up. Jeremy Hanley went up as well to support, who was somebody who actually was an extremely good candidate. And I think there was all the newspaper reports I've seen of this campaign give the prize for the best, most credible candidate to Graham Postles.
Jeremy Hanley acquitted himself.
Your candidate was never allowed to account for himself.
But he didn't choose to account for himself very much.
Well, indeed, that's absolutely right.
Took a Trappist view of by-election.
That is rather an important commentary on that candidate.
But your chairman distinguished himself by saying it was idle speculation that the Tories were going to win. Can't have done much good for the morale of the Tory voters.
The Tory party's position right through this campaign is that we've been in it to win, but we of course recognise that we live in the real world. We're an unpopular government at this stage, and in a critical marginal seat, to be fighting against this background of unpopularity is an uphill struggle.
Nick Harvey, can I reintroduce you as Nick Harvey instead of Mike Hadley, the Liberal Democratic candidate I gather I did before? What do you make of this? Because do you think that the voters are making a clear choice? Or do you think that what Stephen Dorrell says is right, that there's a lot of confused things which he implies can be sorted out by the next election? Bad news for you if it's true.
Well, Labour has won by-elections before. We were looking at mid-staffs earlier, Monmouth and others. I mean, it's not utterly unique for votes to go directly to Labour at mid-term by-elections. I think the low turnout suggests that Labour hasn't really seized the imagination of the good burghers of Dudley West and turned them out in droves. But that having been said, the Conservatives clearly are in very serious trouble, and losing a seat that they're going to have to hold at the election is not going to be good news.
It's quite a classic seat, though, in regard to the Maples memoranda here. If you look at this constituency, it's got more than average home ownership, more average car ownership. very wealthy kind of constituency, very low unemployment. It's the area where the feel-good factor should be quite good, but it wasn't, and that's what Maples was saying, that people don't believe what the government are telling them about the economy, and that's the essential fact in this election.
All right, let's have a look at this by-election campaign, because now that the polls have closed a couple of hours ago, we can report on how it all went. It was an election clearly fought against the background of turmoil. Stephen Dorrell has conceded that. The government defeat over VAT on fuel, rumours of threats to the leadership of John Major were damaging, and locally, as we were saying a moment ago, very few prominent Tory visitors, which won't have helped morale. But even Labour, which mounted a long series of photo opportunities, they've admitted it openly, has been criticised for a campaign that steered clear of serious policy issues debate. Now, Steve Richards, who you saw a moment ago, our political correspondent, looks back at this campaign that led up to this by-election tonight on the way to Christmas.
For some potential voters in Dudley West, the best-kept secret has been the by-election itself. Christmas entertainment in the Maryhill shopping centre has been a more compelling attraction. Anyway, it's been a low-key campaign, making Santa Claus a more accessible figure than many of the visitors from Westminster. This vast shopping centre, supported by a futuristic monorail system, epitomises the changes which took place in the constituency during the 1980s. Believe it or not, this used to be a site of an old steelworks, but now there isn't much manufacturing industry left. Instead, this has become a barometer constituency, strongly conservative as it prospered in the 1980s, but the sort of seat Labour must win if it's to have any hope of a general election victory. For now, there was nothing but gloom for Conservatives as they anxiously awaited a rare visit from a cabinet minister. Their campaign headquarters was at a safe distance from voters on a trading estate.
Nice to see you.
As with all Conservative news conferences, disarray at Westminster was all that mattered. Mr. Howard spent most of his time answering questions on divisions over Europe, before going on to offer an unlikely clarion call. Yes, the government was unpopular, but it was the voters' fault for not paying enough attention.
The unpopularity is down to the fact that people are not focusing on the damage which would be done to this country if the policies of the Labour Party were to be put into effect.
And then he was gone. The journalists have been hostile, but if he had been exposed to any voters on a walkabout, there'd have been more so. Still, at least Mr. Howard turned up, which is more than most cabinet ministers did.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dudley. Yes,
Those Conservatives brave enough to meet the voters faced a thankless task.
The by-election. Yes, I'm your Conservative candidate. No, I don't think so. I think I'm going to vote Labour. But the state is government in at the moment. No, thank you. OK, well, thanks for your time then. OK. Bye-bye.
All this leaves another Conservative by-election candidate musing that his big political chance just came at the wrong time.
If people have in any way moved their votes, it is with a heavy heart. They're not happy with what they see. And if people have switched votes, I'm confident that as the policy effects work through, as the economy continues to improve locally and nationally, those voters will be returning to the Conservative fold.
And Labour haven't exactly had to say very much to persuade Tory voters to leave their traditional fold. They've been strong on photo opportunities, but short on substance, as the stars rolled up to support their candidate. And in the middle of this blitz, a real issue. Labour made the most of their role in the government's defeat over VAT on fuel. Another nail in the coffin for the Tory campaign, but none of this addressed the wider issue of the positive reasons for voting Labour. And when asked, the Labour candidate couldn't give much of an answer either.
Well, you've got to bear in mind that there are a core of Labour voters in Dudley West who are extremely angry, and I'd like to pick up the point that there are people who want to turn out and to give John Major a bloody nose on Thursday night. But they are clearly also saying to this saying to us that they like what they've heard about Tony Blair so far. I don't think voters on the doorstep are fully aware of Labour's policies.
The Liberal Democrats have suffered nationally from the projection of Tony Blair and New Labour, but they never had much of a chance here anyway. In contrast to recent by-elections, where they were the main contenders, Paddy Ashdown could do little more than contemplate an alternative career.
If I could have played a musical instrument, I wouldn't have gone to politics. It must be more fun in doing what you do than there certainly is in the House of Commons where I am.
At the moment, people just want to hit the Tories hard. The hate for the Tories at the moment has to be seen to be believed. And I think the way people perceive that they can give them the biggest kick is to vote Labour.
Even if the voters don't have much clue about Tony Blair's policies, Labour was so confident of victory that at the end of the campaign they produced with a flourish a group of ex-Tory voters ready to sing the new leader's praises.
I think Tony Blair has a strong character, and I think he's got the brains.
There you go.
And I'm not flattering. I don't wish to embarrass or flatter you, Tony.
I think you've finally made a politician blush, which is a when you were talking about the health service.
But will they be as flattering by the time of the general election? Tony Blair concedes that this is the fundamental question arising from the by-election.
It's going to be about whether people are prepared to come and support the Labour Party, today's Labour Party, what we stand for, what we believe in, and whether they will hold with that, not just through a by-election, but through to the general election as well. So it is important for us as well as the Conservatives.
In the end, Christmas comes but once a year. In politics, well, it happens nearly all the time. So it's no great surprise that interest in Christmas has outstripped that of the campaign. Even so, the result itself will light up the political scene, bringing no festive cheer for John Major and an early political gift for Labour.
That report by Steve Richards. Well, now we're joined by what are called the minders of the two main candidates, the MPs already in the House of Commons who look after them during the campaign, Anthony Coombs, who was looking after the Tory Graham Postles, and Jeff Rooker, who was looking after the Labour candidate Ian Pearson. Anthony Coombs, if I could start with you, were you disappointed you didn't get any ministers up there and didn't seem to have proper Tory clout on the streets of Dudley West?
Well, I think we had very good support from ministers. We had 6 cabinet ministers. We also had ministers like Eric Forth, who came out to talk about education, which not only exposed the improved standards that the Conservative education policies have been able to bring about, but also exposed the total lack of coherence of Labour Party policies on things like grant-maintained schools.
Well, what is it that was going wrong during this campaign for you? You must have been as close as anybody to it. Why weren't they voting Tory like they have done ever since '79?
Well, I think that one of the patterns that we've seen already on your programme is that people have voted against the party of government, in this case obviously the Conservative Party, over many occasions on by-elections in previous years, and if you had come back to the party of government during the general election when it really mattered.
Yeah, but what can the Tory party do to get them to do that this time round? Because you can't just say they did it in the past, they'll do it again, can you?
Well, I think it's very important indeed that the Conservative Party maintain the kind of policies that are reducing unemployment by 25% over the last 2 years in Dudley West, and also by making sure that the improved living standards that will be available to the people who have been able to gain jobs as a result are maintained. And I think one of the things that we, the electorate, want to find out is that it's one thing actually having a by-election on the Conservative Party's policies, and another thing actually asking the Labour Party what their policies are themselves.
What about a bit of unity in the party, and what about a Prime Minister who appears to be leading the party and driving it in a way that voters can understand? Those seem to be the two complaints that I picked up, certainly, on the streets of Dudley West, against the Tories.
Yes, obviously, as Stephen Dorrell said, it's been a difficult time over the past 2 weeks for the Conservative Party, and I agree with you that I think it's important the Conservative Party is seen to be united both on issues like Europe and on issues like VAT. And it was unfortunate during this particular by-election that was the opposite impression was given as a result of the 2 votes. But I would anticipate that over the future, when the policies that the Conservative Party is putting together on the economy, on health, on education are seen to be coming right, that the unity of the Conservative Party in Parliament will be improved, and that will become evident to the British people.
So do you blame in part, or maybe in whole, the Tory party for inflicting this damage on themselves tonight?
I think the main reason why and let's be right about it, it's only a 47% turnout, why the people of Dudley West has not come out and supported the Conservative Party the kind of numbers that we would like them to see, is because we have just come out of a recession. Some of the policies that we've had to adopt in terms of increased taxation will have a longer-term beneficial effect, as we've already seen in Dudley West, where unemployment fell by 103 in the last month, 11 out of the last 12 months. And as those become increasingly evident, I think that the people of Dudley West and the rest of the country will come back and support the Conservative Party.
Right. Well, Jeff Rooker is beside you, and he was looking after Ian Pearson. Indeed, there were some who said we didn't hear very much of Ian Pearson. We did hear quite a lot from you. Was he a good candidate for Labour, or was he, as some say, just a cipher who sat there and is going to win simply because of the disaffection with the Tories?
I think he was an excellent candidate. He'll be a first-class member of Parliament. The fact of the matter is, Ian Pearson kicked off his campaign even before the Tory candidate. I think Ian Pearson took this election very seriously, and the Labour Party took it much more seriously than the Conservative Party, shown by the interest of the shadow cabinet ministers that came to Dudley West day in and day out. And what's more, they didn't come into Dudley West and skid off back to London without speaking and listening to the voters of Dudley West. That was the difference between the Labour campaign and the Tory campaign. We took it seriously, they didn't.
Unlike other moments when Labour might have been seen to be poised on the edge of victory in a general election, it was very striking this time round that what all the voters talked about were Tory things they didn't like and not a great deal about Labour things they did like.
Well, I mean, that just is not true. You see, the real problem in some ways is a campaign in late December. The electoral register is 14 months old. We've had the second highest turnout, by the way, in a December parliamentary election in living memory. So I don't take much of the criticism of 47%. It is the second highest December turnout. The voters were talking on the doorsteps, in the factories, the offices and the shops, to our candidate and our shadow cabinet ministers who visited them, about their aspirations for the future and how what Labour was saying and talking about met with their own aspirations.
So you think Labour was strong on policy? It wasn't just a love affair with Tony Blair?
Oh, absolutely strong on policy. I can quote chapter and verse of what was put forward by the Labour cabinet, shadow cabinet ministers day in and day out, and our candidate, and the visits they made to listen to the people of Dudley when the press wasn't there in the early part of the campaign, that would make your ears burn, Mr. Dimbleby.
Make them?
Well, first of all, I don't know how often you came to Dudley. There was the house building regeneration programme put forward by Frank Dobson. There was the industrial regeneration programme put forward by Jack Cunningham on his first of his two visits, when he was meeting high-tech industrialists in Dudley, sending 60% of their products abroad, but can't get the labour because it's not trained and not skilled enough, at a period when we've had 15 years of Tory government that's ignored this vital issue. Margaret Beckett, on her visits to doctors who are being forced to opt out of their normal operation into fund-holding practice, putting forward our proposals for a more modern, patient-friendly health service, unlike Virginia Bottomley, who didn't go to a hospital, a health centre, listen to a doctor or meet a nurse.
But
now, I can give you the rest. You've asked me for them. I don't know how much time you've got.
No, I talked to the people who came to that affair with Tony Blair when you had the Tories who were going to vote Labour sitting around, and talked to all of them. They gave a very strong impression. They were staunch Tories. They rather disapproved, incidentally, of Mrs Thatcher being got rid of. They said they were voting for Tony Blair because they couldn't stand John Major. They didn't say they were voting for Tony Blair because they liked Labour policy. That's my point.
Oh, yeah, well, OK, that was your one example, one visit. But the point about it is, this is not a traditional Labour seat. We can't win, and we knew we could not win this seat unless we could persuade traditional Conservative voters that they could trust the Labour Party. Now, those people who met Tony Blair the other morning, we did not know what they were going to say to Tony Blair. All we knew from the doorstep when we'd canvassed them, that they were lifelong Tory voters, fed up to the back teeth with this shambolic government and who felt betrayed by this government, and who were willing to explain to the new Labour leader, putting forward new Labour policies, what their aspirations for the future were, and to see where the convergence with what their hopes and aims for the future were, where they converged with what Tony Blair was saying. I listened to most of the conversation. You listened to it all. There was a convergence of views for the future of our country and those families. That's why they came over to vote Labour.
OK, thank you very much. Peter Kellner wants to come in on your remark about turnout.
We've been talking about the turnout on December elections. Now, I was slightly surprised by what Jeff Rooker said, that it was the second highest December turnout in living memory. What is true is that December turnouts the last 20 years, it's the 6th December by-election in the last 20 years, all the turnouts have been grouped very narrowly between 47 and 51%. So to some extent one can say this is absolutely par for the course for a December by-election. However, it has to be said that this one is at the bottom end of that range. It actually isn't true to say that within living memory this is the second highest turnout.
And Jeff Rooker, you said something about not being the kind of seat you'd normally expect to hold. You imply by that you may not hold it at a general election.
Well, first of all, when the general election comes, Dudley West won't exist, because Dudley will be split north-south and not east-west. That's a rather pedantic point. The fact of the matter is, on the issues that John Prescott put earlier, on the social class of makeup of the constituency, on the home ownership, the car ownership, the educational qualifications, the unemployment rate, this seat is more akin to Guildford and Winchester than any other seat in the West Midlands. We knew that when we started. It would not be an easy fight, which is why we had to be constructive and positive and take the election seriously from day one, which is what we've done.
Stephen Dorrell, you want to comment on this?
Dudley West was nonetheless a seat that was held by Labour as recently as 1979. And so to represent it as being a seat that is somehow far beyond Labour's normal ambitions is simply rubbish.
Robin Oakley.
Yes, it was a seat not only held by Labour before 79, but held with 8,500 majority in the previous election before that. It's precisely the kind of seat which Labour was losing to Thatcherite conservatism in 1979 and 1983, and the kind of seat that Labour has got to win back to win a general election.
Anthony Coombs, just before we leave there, you have a comment on what's being said beside you or down here?
Yeah, well, on the so-called Labour Party policies, I think really Jeff Rooker protests too much. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Labour Party campaign was all glitz and mirrors. For instance, let me take two issues. First of all, on grant-maintained schools, where they're in a hell of a tangle. We asked the Labour Party candidate what a framework for democracy meant so far as grant-maintained schools were concerned. He said he was going to consult with local grant-maintained schools and was indeed consulting. When we asked the grant-maintained schools whether he'd actually been there, he actually said that it turned out that he hadn't even been. The second thing was on taxation. I mean, they didn't come up with any alternatives as to VAT on fuel whatsoever. In fact, when Harriet Harman came, she put forward two completely different alternatives on the very same morning.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Let's just have a look now. We've had the candidate, Ian Pearson, for Labour, just arriving at Dudley. We're waiting for the vote, which we think will... There he is. No?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to move towards a draft result.
10 minutes or so, we think. Ian Pearson, who's the Joint Chief Executive of the West Midlands Enterprise Board, does that kind of work. The Conservative is a salesman of insurance policies. And he's 35-year-old Ian Pearson, married with a couple of children, and likely to be the Labour candidate for Dudley West, but only until the general election, we're told, Peter, because come the general election, it's going to be Dudley North or Dudley South. I don't know which he'll get. But anyway.
The boundaries will change, because we've got to bear in mind there just could be a step election, and the boundaries might not have changed by then. It might be, what, 3 or 4 weeks' time? Who knows? Now, what about, you never know. Supposing
the early January election.
Supposing everything collapses under Mr. Major. Let's look at the, let's look at the state of party support in the country as a whole, as measured by the opinion polls. Now, these are the raw, unadjusted figures. There's the general election back there. Mr. Major won it quite comfortably. But look what's happened to the Conservative vote. The Conservative support, as measured by the opinion polls, unadjusted, completely raw, not adjusted for any bias against the Conservatives. There's the latest gallop up there at 61%. There are the Tories down there at 22%. A record gap between Conservative and Labour by any measurement. Now, since the general election, the pollsters have been looking at the way they've been taking polls from people, been surveying opinion. And they've come up with what they call an adjusted measure, allowing for perhaps a bias against the Tories. People more shy about saying they're going to vote Conservative than vote Labour or Liberal Democrat. And there you can see that line there, which shows the adjusted figures, allowing for that bias against the Conservatives, but still by any measure, the Tories very low indeed down there on 26%. You can see that even with that small gap there, nevertheless you have a unique collapse of Conservative support right the way through there, from something like the beginning of '93 until the present moment. Now, the very latest of those adjusted polls, making all allowance for bias against the Conservatives, was an ICM poll just a week ago. And this ICM poll came up with these figures. Labour on 53%, the Conservatives on 26%, the Liberal Democrats on 17% and the others on 4%. Now this admittedly was after the government's defeat on value-added tax, but even so, 27% there is the gap between the Conservatives and Labour. What would that mean if there were a general election on the basis of that latest poll? And here we have the chamber of the House of Commons. Let's go through the doors now and see just what would happen and how dramatically the pattern of party representation would differ from what it is at the moment. There are the opposition benches over there, and on these opposition benches, on the changes in that latest ICM poll, Mr. Major would be on the opposition benches with 103 MPs, 103 Conservatives. Beside him, Paddy Ashton, remember 20 Liberal Democrats elected in the last election with 41. Even though the Liberal Democrats are down in the polls at the moment, the Tories are down much further, so some Tory seats would go Liberal Democrat, 25 others over here. And here's the 326, the magic figure you need for an overall majority on the government side. Where would Mr. Blair's Labour Party be on the government benches if there were a general election on the sort of measures the polls are suggesting at the moment? Right the way through the winning post, 482 Labour MPs, and that would mean when you add all the opposition up together that there would be 169 of them, 482 in the government, and the Labour majority will be 330. Now, of course, that won't happen. There will be a Tory recovery, no doubt, between now and the election, but that's a very, very strong base, David, for Labour to move off from.
Thanks so much, Peter. Well, we're joined now by Bill Cash, the MP for Stafford, down at Westminster. You're smiling because you've just heard the scale of Tory defeat at the general election predicated on the present polls, I assume.
No, I'm smiling because of the absurdity of these descriptive diagrams that we get, which bear absolutely no relationship whatever to what's going to happen.
Well, let's talk about what may have happened at Dudley West. Some people would say that you, admittedly you didn't lose the whip, but you are the gang of anti-Europeans who caused all Major's trouble and the Tory party trouble at this election, and that's why they've done so badly.
Well, that's the sort of remark that I expect from you, actually. The fact is that by no means at all am I anti-European. I voted yes in '75, again for the Single European Economic Area. I supported our European candidate extremely vigorously during the European elections. And in fact, the idea that it's disunity that's causing this, I think is a grave mistake. I think the real problem is the fact that if you look back to Black Wednesday, massively high interest rates and the exchange rate mechanism, which was followed by people having to go on to social security and all that sort of thing, massive increase in public sector borrowing up to 50 billion. We then had to reimpose taxation, which broke our tax promises, in order to be able to reclaim the amount of money that had been lost. And that, in fact, includes this attempt to double the gas and fuel, because that was imposed, or was going to be imposed, for that reason. So it's actually a breaking of tax promises, disillusionment and lack of trust that's caused the problem, which I think we will recover from. And for this very good reason, if we don't go back into this idiotic exchange rate mechanism, if in fact we do maintain the recovery, which is the result of coming out of the ERM, which is doing brilliantly well at the moment, both in my constituency and, as we heard from Anthony Coombs, also in Dudley, then I think we'll find that we will regain the confidence of the electors, but we must have a policy on Europe which is in fact going to help us both to stay in Europe, to work effectively within it, but at the same time to make sure...
Who do you...
No, wait a minute.
No, you've gone on a long time. I want to put another question to you, because I know you enjoy them.
Just to make sure that we do actually win on a sound basis, because the Labour Party are up to their eyes in the ERM and everything goes with it.
Do you blame John Major or Kenneth Clarke for all those tribulations that you've so vividly described?
Well, I mean, one only has to look at the facts, and I think we need to, as I said in an article in the Times recently, to come clean. I think a little bit of humility probably will be required in order to make sure that we don't make those mistakes again.
Humility from, not from you, clearly, but from whom?
Well, I think that it would be good to admit that we had made a few mistakes, that those mistakes are now out of the way, that we are in fact now going to rebuild on true Conservative and Tory principles the sort of policies that will gain the respect of the electorate. I think we can do that very easily indeed.
And is the first step towards that getting the 9 back?
Well, I think it would be very helpful, and I do hope that that happens by the time we come back in January. Just one other thing I would add, actually, is this. When people talk about disunity leading to difficulties, curiously enough, when we had the elections, the county council elections last year, when we were in the middle of this sort of Maastricht saga, in fact, in my constituency, we won all the county council seats in my constituency. If you look across the country, and it's also applied, by the way, to the other Eurosceptic seats as well. If you look across the country, in fact, exactly the opposite happened in areas where people have been pursuing policies which were Europhiliac.
You make it sound as though disunity is a positive advantage.
Well, I think if you get your policies right, and that is what people want, and the majority vote in opinion polls, even a Sheffield survey, very respectable university survey that came out a few weeks ago, demonstrates that 74% of those in the House of Commons on the Conservative backbenches, including actually a lot of ministers who were included in the survey, in fact were in favour of the sort of policies the Maastricht rebels were pursuing at the time when Maastricht was on.
All right. Robin Oakley, do you want to comment on what Bill Cash is saying?
Yes, Bill Cash is there saying that one of the major factors in the Tories' unpopularity is the lack of trust on tax now, and Labour have fought a very effective campaign on that. He, like a lot of other Tories, seems to be putting his faith in the idea that if the Conservatives can deliver tax cuts, the Chancellor in his budget next year, then everything will come right for the Tories. But we can't any longer be so certain of that, I think, because those tax cuts, when they come, are going to be so discounted. We'll all have been talking about them for so long. The country's going to be bitterly disappointed if there aren't huge tax cuts then, but it may well say, well, hang on a minute, because this is a government that's been putting up taxes. Taxes are going to continue to increase this current year. Living standards are going to continue to fall. There'll be less take-home pay as a result of changes next April. And there's absolutely no guarantee, it seems to me, that the Tories really will reap this bonus from tax cuts next autumn.
Point to have a look at the Conservative Party and how they're faring, Peter.
Well, indeed. Let's just have a little more close look at how governments can recover. There's that very powerful position for Labour there, way ahead, 27% ahead of the Conservative, 26%. Can Mr Major's Conservative Party recover from that position? The answer is yes, it has happened in the past. You can get up from the mid-20s up to a sort of 40%, 42% winning position. Take, first of all, Jim Callaghan's government, June 77, equivalent time in that Parliament, right down in the doldrums on 34%. He managed to put on just 1% between then and the next general election in 1979. But he did at least go up. Here's Mrs Thatcher, equivalent position, February 1990, middle of the poll tax protest, 35%. She managed to put on, with Mr Major's help, of course, he took over the party, 8% between then and the general election of 92. So that was a big increase for the Conservatives. There's Mrs Thatcher in February 86, 30% there. By the time of the 87 election, 13% advance. Mrs Thatcher at 27%, very nearly Mr Major's figure there in January 82. Between January 82 and the 83 election, with a bit of help from the Falklands War, an addition of 17% for Mrs Thatcher's Conservative Party. So there's Mr Major on 26%. If he can get something like 15, 16, 17%, he could be within reach of that 42, 43% you need for victory. But do bear in mind one very important thing. No Conservative Party, no Labour Party in government has been so far behind for so long in the polls as this Conservative Party. There's the 40% you need to be within reach of for a general election victory. And here's what's happened to Mr Major in the last couple of years. Now, these are the averaged adjusted figures. Again, most favourable possible figures for the Conservative Party. Even on those adjusted figures, that is a unique disaster for the Conservatives. The nearest we've had to that is Mrs Thatcher between 1980 and 1982, when a rather similar pattern of low public support was traced out for the Conservative Party. But look at one very important difference. Mrs Thatcher was up against Michael Foot's Labour Party. There's Michael Foot's Labour Party. Look how little of an opposition the Labour Party was. Of course, this was the time of the SDP alliance. People weren't then deserting the Tories for Labour. They were going to the SDP alliance. Mr Major, on the other hand, has Tony Blair as his opponent, and a Labour Party which, watch that red line there, goes soaring up from way back there at the beginning of 93, up here now to 53% in 94. What's happening is that people are leaving the Tories, and apparently, so they're telling the pollsters anyway, going to Labour. Very dangerous for the Conservatives.
What I'm not quite sure, Peter, is whether your first one, which shows that the Tories can recover, is the one that you believe, or the second one, which shows that they can't.
Well, clearly, you have to look at all the figures. The Tories can recover. Any government can recover from a very low base like 25, 26%. But the danger for the Tories is it's been there so long at that level. And that is quite unique in history. And also, it's not the Liberal Democrats who are in opposition this time in true fact. It's the Labour Party. And that's why it's so dangerous for the Tories.
John Prescott, can the Tories recover?
Well, I think you can show a lot of evidence to show after these by-elections they have recovered. I mean, that's what we're seeing here, but I think there's an awful lot to be said that they're very low down, and I think one significant factor that's taken place, it points out that the Democrats, the SPD, and all those people have been playing a part in this, have affected Labour's votes, and I think many of those people have returned now, and if there's anything aspect of a new Labour Party, it's that they feel more confident to return to the Labour Party, and I think that's the significant factor, and 15 years in power, people think these are tired, out of ideas, and want changing, and I think that's a significant factor.
Stephen Dorrell?
Well, but what we're still left with is that New Labour, while it certainly may be less threatening than Michael Foot's Labour to a potential floating voter, I think it would be, it would obviously not be credible to deny that that is true. It's maybe less threatening, but it's still not convinced any significant proportion of new voters what it stands for. It's
What's
back to the lesson
for saying it?
Well,
Yeah,
we're back to the lesson of what people say in Dudley West. When you ask them why they're voting Labour, what they tell you is that the government's unpopular. Well, we know the government's unpopular. What we don't know, and what nobody knows, is what the policy focus that Tony Blair will bring to the Labour Party will look like.
But he doesn't need a policy focus. If they're all saying Tony Blair is a new man, and as John Prescott was saying, we've had 15 years of the Tories, it's time for a change.
Yes, and what we've also got is a new leader whose honeymoon period will wear off, and we've got a government and a party on our side of the House that clearly recognises the need to emerge from VAT and European rows and to set out clearly a programme for the country which will demonstrate sustained economic performance, improving health service, improving education, demonstrating improving living standards and improving social services.
It doesn't sound from what Bill Cash was saying as though that was going to be that easy to iron that out.
But of course these are difficult and important issues, but what Bill Cash and I have in common, and right across the Tory party we have in common, is a commitment to emerge from the difficulties which have obviously we've encountered and to put forward a coherent, clear strategy.
Nick Harvey, the implication of all that is that the Lib Dems are the ones who've really been squeezed here, and New Labour has pushed you to one side. I mean, on Dudley West, for instance, do you expect to push the Tories into third place and come second, like Paddy Ashdown said, or do you think that's just a whistling in the dark?
I think that's unlikely. We'll have to wait and see on that. But it does look as if we will at least have saved our deposit and have done better in equivalent circumstances than, for example, Labour did in earlier by-elections. I don't think that what we've seen tonight does show that we're being squeezed. Peter Snow's graphics actually showed that even if our vote were to slip down slightly, we could end up with twice as many seats. And in point of fact, if there's a swing away from the Conservatives in the areas where we are poised in second place, we'll do perfectly nicely out of that, thank you very much. The Tories can still stage something of a comeback, but time is running out on them very much, and if they haven't improved by this time next year, they'll do something dramatic about it in the form of the leadership.
But the continuity and the scale of support from Labour since Tony Blair came in has been very, very considerable. Well, for whatever reason, that is a significant factor this time.
But Tony Blair's only been leader since July. It's hardly a great record of continuity.
Well, you can go back to John Smith's time, if you like. You can see an ever-increasing share of the vote for Labour and maintaining it.
I'm simply picking up your point, John, which I agree with, incidentally, that Tony Blair's election as leader has created a balloon of Labour's support. You said that's been sustained, which indeed it has, but only for a period of 4 months.
All right, we're just coming up to 1 o'clock. There's the Labour candidate at Dudley West. I can see it, you can see, yes, there he is. Talking, waiting, and it shouldn't be too long that we have to wait now for this result from Dudley West to come in. Peter Kellner, very briefly, I'll bring you in, and then I want to go to Peter Snow, who's going to...
You talk about Labour policies and the lack of them. I think it's possibly the wrong issue. I think that in the past, Labour has done less well than the Liberals or the SDP in by-elections because there's been a fear amongst worried Tories about Labour, a fear connected sometimes on disarmament or nationalisation or the trade unions. And what I got when I was up in Dudley, and I think it's borne out by the Naples Memorandum, is that fear is no longer there. And I think that is what tonight's election will prove. And it does seem to me that if you can't re-engender fear amongst your worried supporters, so talking to Stephen Dorrell here, you can't engender fear of Labour amongst your worried supporters. You'll find it much harder to get them back when you found it after previous mid-terms.
All right. Peter, let's have a look at the swingometer, because it looks as though Dudley may be coming up to the
Let's stand by, indeed, as you say, for a big swing in Dudley. And here's the measure of swing, just to give you an idea what it means in terms of seats. These are the vulnerable Conservative MPs here, vulnerable to a swing to Labour along the red line. Here are the vulnerable Labour MPs, vulnerable to a swing to the Conservatives. And what we do on our swingometer is we turn the MPs who are covered by the pendulum. For example, here the Tories under a Labour swing red, and if there's a swing to Labour, these red MPs over here will, of course, turn blue for a swing to the Conservatives. Now, if there's no swing at all from the last general election, you can expect a majority of something like 21, what the Conservatives had at the last general election 2.5 years ago. 1%, just 1% would turn 18 of these blue Conservative seats red, and that would mean the Conservative majority would be wiped out. What Labour need for an overall majority is about 55 of these blue seats to turn red. A 4% swing would be a Labour majority of 1. And just tucked under the pendulum there is Dudley West, an absolutely critical seat, 54th most vulnerable Conservative seat. That's one Labour have to gain the next general election. Here we have very quickly the swing that they had in the European elections, 12%, and here is the swing in the 18% in the latest poll. That'll be a Labour majority of 300, as we said. David, back to you.
Peter, thanks very much. Well, at Dudley West, they're coming up onto the stage, ready for the declaration. There are 10 candidates here, incidentally not Screaming Lord Sutch, who failed to put up a deposit this time round, but we've got candidates from the National Front, the UK Independence Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Liberal Party as well, 21st Century Party, Labour, the Tories, New Britain, Freedom of Choice for Smokers, Forest, and the Natural Law Party. And they're all gathering there with the returning officer, or the deputy returning officer, as it may be, in the mayoral chain, standing there waiting to give this result. And we'll go over to Dudley now.
Election for Member of Parliament for the Dudley West constituency, the declaration of the result of the poll. I, John Edward Simpson, being the returning officer for the Dudley West constituency, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election held on Thursday, the 15th of December 1994, was as follows. Andrew Carmichael,
National Front,
561. Malcolm Ronald Floyd,
UK Independence Party,
590. Michael Peter James Hadley,
Liberal Democrat,
3,154. Michael Stephen Hyde,
Liberal Party
548. Colin Richard Palmer Manton, known as the Lord of Manton,
21st Century Party,
55. Michael Henry Natras,
New Britain,
146. Marjorie Diana Nicholson, 77.
Freedom for Choice of Smokers,
John David Oldbury,
Natural Law
70.
Party,
Ian Perez Pearson,
Labour,
28,400. And Graham Eric Postles,
Conservative,
7,706. The number of ballot papers rejected was 27, and I hereby declare that Ian Perez Pearson has been duly elected to serve as Member of Parliament for the Dudley West constituency.
So, Labour, no surprise, takes it, and there's the result. 28,400 for Labour, Ian Pearson. Conservatives, 7,706. The Liberal Democrats, 3,154, well down in third place. Let's hear from the victor.
Right, thank you. Right. I'd like to thank the returning officer, the Chief Executive and his staff for the expeditious way in which they've conducted the count this evening. I'd also like to thank the police for the smooth and trouble-free occasion we've had tonight. On a personal note, I'd like to thank my father, Ferris Pearson, who sadly isn't going to be with us tonight. He died 10 years ago, but I learnt my values from him and the importance of public service. I'd like to thank my agent, Fraser Kemp, and his campaign team and all the members of Dudley West Labour Party who've worked so hard in not just this by-election campaign, but in the council by-election campaigns before then. And all the people from outside, the Labour Party people from outside, who've come here today and before to make this a tremendous victory for the Labour Party. The biggest by-election swing since the Second World War. Tonight, the people of Dudley West did not just confirm how despised and ridiculed the Tories are, they chose in huge numbers to register a positive vote for New Labour under the leadership of Tony Blair. The people of Dudley West have spoken for the nation. They have brought closer the end of this discredited, shambolic, tired, sleazy government. Labour's victory represents a huge shift occurring in British politics. It shows that the Tories have lost the trust of the British people. It shows that the tide of politics is flowing irreversibly towards Labour. But this victory does not mean that we can sit back and expect to be handed the next general election. We cannot be complacent. We still have a long way to go. We must continue to work for the trust of the British people if we are to make sure that we win the next general election. Tonight's victory, however, speaks louder than any poll, louder than any speculation. It represents real people, angry people, betrayed people, people saying things don't have to be as bad as this. That is why they support the path set out by Tony Blair and New Labour. For a new Britain, a Britain where we won't settle for second best, a Britain we can once again be proud of. Now, the Chancellor, he said that no one should take seriously promises made on a wet night in Dudley. Well, my message to the government is that the people of Dudley expect
in Dudley West there with a huge majority, a record swing, almost the largest swing this century in a by-election from Conservatives to Labour. Let's have a look at the result in detail with Peter.
Right, David. Well, here we have the Dudley West result then. A disaster for the Conservatives. Records broken here. First of all, we have the scores, the votes. There's Ian Pearson's 28,400, way ahead of the Conservatives, who are, to be fair, comfortably in second place from the Liberal Democrats, who might have hoped to beat them into second place. The majority in Dudley West, a huge 20,694 in what was a comfortable Conservative seat in the 1992 election. And the share in Dudley West, huge pile of votes for Labour, 69%, very nearly what that latest poll was suggesting, 69%, ahead of the 19% for the Conservatives, 8% for the Liberal Democrats, and the others on 5%. And the change that represents on the general election in this comfortable Conservative seat last time, now a hugely safe Labour seat, plus 28% the Labour vote, minus 3% the Liberal Democrats, and minus 30% the Conservatives. Now, in order to find out the swing, you add the Tories to Labour's, you add Tory minus to Labour's plus, you get 58, you divide by 2, and I think you get 29. Something like that. That is a record swing, with one extraordinary exception. Something happened in Liverpool, Wavertree in 35, but the real record was Putney in 1934, 27%. This one beats all records, plus 5% the others. Let's just have a look now at the story of Conservative contests over the last period since the 43% John Major scored in the general election 2.5 years ago. Down 29% the Conservatives were in Newbury. The Lib Dems won that one. They were down a record 32% in the Christchurch by-election in July last year. The Liberal Democrats walked away with that one as well. Then we had 21% down in the 6 by-elections before this one. This year, that's an average of drop of 21% in those 6 by-elections. Pretty hopeless seats for the Conservatives, except for Eastleigh, of course, which the Liberal Democrats also took. Down 15% on their general election, 43% in the Euro elections. down by 17% in the opinion polls. That's the latest ICM poll I mentioned earlier, so you can see roughly where they are when people are asking the question, how did you vote in the general election? Down 17% on the 43%. And now we have the Dudley drop. There it is, down 30%. Not as big a drop as the drop to the Liberal Democrats over there in Christchurch, but the biggest drop in a Conservative fight with Labour, the biggest drop in a straight Labour-Conservative fight in recorded history. And as I said, the swing also the biggest we've ever seen. So there it is, David, a disaster for Conservatives.
Well, Stephen Dorrell, this is going to need more than just sitting tight and saying things are going to come all right in a couple of years' time, isn't it? This is a major disaster for the Tories.
Well, first of all, I congratulate the Labour candidate on his victory, and it's obviously a bad result for us. I don't disguise that at all. I don't actually accept the argument that we should be comparing this only with other Tory Labour swings. The reality was that the opposition in by-elections, in earlier by-elections in recent years, has quite often been the Lib Dems, and we know that the electorate in general is now much more liable to swing around than was the case a few years ago. So I actually think a 29% swing, while it's a bad result, and we must ensure that we look at it carefully and learn the lessons of it, I actually think it runs pretty much in line with Christchurch, with Newbury, and recent by-election losses to the Liberals.
You're not saying you're not more worried by people leaving Tories for Labour than you are by them leaving Tories for the Liberal Democrats, are you? Because, I mean, Liberal Democrats, they come back home, but Labour's a different matter.
There are two separate issues here. Of course it's true, I agree with something Peter was saying earlier, that Labour is more threatening, or is less threatening to floating voters, and therefore more of a threat to us. That is true. But in terms of the swing measured in a by-election, I think that this is a swing away from the government, which is, broadly speaking, on the same scale as the swing away from the government that we've had in Tory Lib Dem by-election victories in recent years.
That's true, but Peter Kellner, what do you...
But that is precisely the point. In the last 30 years, there have been 11 by-elections, this is now the 12th, when Conservative support has dropped by 20 percentage points or more. The other 11 have all been ones where the Liberals or the SDP have won or come a very close second. Labour's been right out of it. Wherever Labour has been the threat to you, in those years, your support has never dropped by more than 18 or 19 points to the most. That was mid-Staffordshire. And it's now down by 30 points where Labour is challenging. So I really do think this is in a different league.
No, of course it's true that it's unusual for us to suffer a swing against the government or against the Tory party to the benefit of Labour. The reason why it's unusual is that Labour hasn't been in a fit state to attract support from us over any of that time. And to look back before the 1980s is to look back to an era when everybody knows that voting loyalties were much more stable than they are now. So my point is not that we shouldn't be worried about this. Of course we should be worried about it. But this is a by-election we fought against Labour. We fought other by-elections within this Parliament against the Liberals, and our support has fallen by roughly comparable amounts in Dudley, as in Christchurch, as in Newbury.
But if Labour is now in a fit state, as you say, that is very alarming for the Tories. Well, and the question is whether Tory backbenchers won't now treat this election, like those seminal ones we talked of before, as the moment perhaps to start mounting a serious challenge for a change of leadership.
No, I don't think they'll do that. And in any case, the news isn't entirely good for Labour in this result. We talk all the time about percentages, and we know about the difficulty of getting electors to go to the poll in a fortnight before Christmas. But this, nonetheless, has been a by-election fought where passions have run relatively high, and it doesn't alter the fact that the Labour vote is down in this by-election result compared with the general election vote. 29,000 votes down to 28,000 votes.
But wait a minute, Stephen. The Conservative vote is down from 35,000 to just under 8,000. Unbelievable. But listen, in absolute numbers,
they've stayed at home. They've stayed at home.
Possibly, but the Conservative vote has fallen by more than 3/4. I've gone through the record books. As far as I can find, the Conservative vote has never, ever fallen in numbers by anything like this amount. The greatest I can find is a 65% drop in Eastleigh just the other month. So, you know, we are talking about, in terms of numbers, a Conservative performance which is way off the scale even of previous mid-term by-election.
Well, John Prescott, what you're accused of is losing 540 voters from the general election when you had 28,940 and you're down to 28,400. Where did they go?
It's no wonder Mr. Maples is right, isn't it? You can't believe what they say. He's got to put the best face on it. But look, let's be clear. This is a remarkable victory for the Labour Party. There's no doubt about that. 6 out of 10 voted this time compared to the last election. But the votes that Labour got in absolute terms basically stayed the same. They lost 3/4 of the votes. The Liberals lost half of it. It's a record swing to us. It's a remarkable majority. And frankly, to sit here and talk about that the Labour Party, the new Labour Party, can't get across to people, well, I think you've had the answer from the people from Dudley today. We had a good candidate, a very good campaign and a good team. And I'm afraid that what we've seen in Dudley is a clear message from people who clearly feel they've been betrayed by this government. And this is going to give a tremendous impetus to Tony Blair and the Labour Party and going on to winning more and more victories.
I know it spoils a good line, but you got the same vote, essentially, in this election, by-election.
You lost 3/4.
I know, and what we have to do is get them back. There is no evidence in those figures that they came out to vote for you in significant numbers.
Look, you can assume, can I just say on the point? You can assume not every Labour voter turned out. When he goes down from something like 80-odd% to 40%, even Labour voters may stay at home. It's a factor of December. Some of those clearly must be swings. Some are from Liberals, some are from Tories. We can argue about what it is, but it is a swing to Labour, which we weren't getting before, from Tories and from Liberals, and that's the significance of New Labour.
We're now joined by, let's hear him, the victor at Dudley West, Ian Pearson. Thank you very much. Congratulations on your victory, Mr. Pearson.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
We gather you've failed to get 540 Labour voters to vote for you this time who voted Labour at the last general election. Everybody here is very concerned about that.
I'm very pleased with the majority that we've got tonight. We've got what I understand to be the biggest post-war by-election swing in history. I think the Labour Party is tremendously encouraged by that. We've had large numbers of Tory switchers coming directly over to Labour because they like New Labour and the policies of Tony Blair.
Now, what about the argument that Stephen Dorrell's been putting, that the Tory voters may have stayed at home because the turnout is a great deal lower than the ESLER by-election, for instance, where it was over 70%. And this is only 47%. It could be possible, couldn't it, that they've stayed at home because they're cross, but they haven't come over to you?
I think a lot of Tory voters have actually come over, straight over to Labour and voted for us. You've got to remember that this was a cold night in December. The result that we polled is very similar to the result we polled in Portillo's by-election that was held in December. In fact, if anything, my suspicion is that there are a number of Labour voters who stayed away because they were telling us on the doorstep it was going to be a walkover. There were a lot of angry ex-Tories who came over because they liked Labour, New Labour under Tony Blair.
What do they actually like about it? What did you hear them say that they liked?
They believe that the Labour Party is a party that keeps its promises. The Labour Party is a party they can trust. The Labour Party is a party that will ensure that the National Health Service is run efficiently. They believe that the Labour Party will look after them and their children and will help raise their living standards.
I gather at the general election this place is going to be turned upside down and run north-south, not east-west. What happens to you? Are you just there until the general election, or will you get a candidature in one of the other seats?
I hope to be representing a Dudley seat for a long time to come.
And this is the first time that Labour's had it since '79. Do you see it as natural Labour territory, or do you see it now, Dudley West, as prosperous territory, beginning to get through the recession, recovering, and dangerous for Labour?
This isn't normal Labour territory. It isn't a traditional inner core Labour seat. It is a relatively prosperous area, but it's relatively prosperous people who are now saying that Labour is the party that we can trust and Labour is the party that meets our needs and aspirations.
In your opinion, is the recovery in Dudley in economic terms marked at the moment? Is it what people are saying about the recovery happening, but the voters not giving credit to the Tories for it?
I don't think it's that the voters aren't giving credit for any recovery that's going on at all. It's that the voters of Dudley are sick to the back teeth of the Tories, and they like what they hear from us. I must keep stressing that, because that's something that's come over plainly to us over the last month of this campaign.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pearson, for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Well, what happened to the Liberal Democrats?
Well, I think the Liberal Democrats have done better than we might have expected to. I said to you...
8%, wasn't it?
Yes, I said to you earlier on that we would be comparing the result with, for example, the Christchurch by-election, And I'm glad to say I don't find myself in the position that Mr. Peter Mandelson found himself in for Labour at Newbury, where he was looking into camera and saying that 1.9% and a lost deposit was a good result. We've actually done very much better. The squeeze on us has not been as great as it has been on Labour, where we have been the clear second-place candidate, and I don't think that's a bad result for us at all.
And what's your analysis of this result overall? Do you believe what Stephen Dorrell says about Tories staying away rather than voting Labour and a small turnout?
I think you have to recognise that the small turnout means that there has been a swing from the Conservatives to Labour, and that people have gone straight across and made that vote. I think it does show that the Conservatives are in serious trouble, but can we just get these swings into perspective? I don't want to take anything away from Mr. Pearson, who is to be congratulated on a very good result, but we actually got a 35% swing in Christchurch and a 48% swing in Southwark and Bermondsey, so the suggestion that it's a historic swing since the war is not really on.
Robin Oakley, in terms of the sort of political scene now, this result is obviously a record in all sorts of ways that have been described numerically. What's the message it will bring to John Major and to the Tory backbenchers tomorrow morning?
The crucial message is that the Conservatives are now just as much a prey to Labour in by-elections as they have been to the Liberal Democrats. I said at the start of the programme a key test for Tony Blair's new Labour would be if they could achieve the kind of swings and the kind of drop in the Conservative vote that Liberal Democrats have been able to achieve earlier in this Parliament. Clearly the fear factor as far as Labour is concerned has modified enormously. Labour has passed that test and passed it with flying colours. It will be a very nervous business now for John Major and his team. But one of the interesting questions, I think, is whether they can actually last out this Parliament now if they go on losing by-elections at the rate they have been doing. The majority after Dudley, technically with the whipless Tories around at the moment, gives them a minority of 5. Well, supposing we're generous and we assume that the campaign to free the Westminster 8.5, as it's being put now, is successful, and they're taken back and given back the Tory whip, there's a government majority then of 13. It only needs 7 more losses in by-elections to wipe that out. The Economist had an actuary do a study a while ago as to the number of Conservative MPs likely to die in the course of an average 5-year Parliament.
Grisly study, I
Grisly study, indeed, but that was 10.73 Tory MPs were likely to die. Sadly, we have lost 3 Conservatives already in this Parliament. Leaves another 7 to go. 7 more losses.
7.73.
7.7. Well, yes, the 0.73, we could cut a point there, I think. But it is now very finely balanced on the average actuarial calculations for a Parliament. It must... John Major is going to have to look at these figures and say they're probably going to have to hang on to the bitter end in this Parliament if they're going to have a chance of winning the general election. But will he be able to hang on that long if the actuarial considerations are borne out?
And just before we have a look at that result, does it mean that another leadership challenge and all that turmoil on the backbenches is likely to follow from tonight?
No, I don't actually believe that we will see immediate pressure for a leadership challenge. I think there would have been a leadership challenge by now if the Conservatives who want to get rid of John Major were able to agree on the candidate they would back to do so. They still can't agree on a candidate who would suit them to replace him, and John Major got through the Tory process, which happens once in every parliamentary session, just before he hit real trouble on VAT and the European Communities Bill, and he can't technically be challenged till next November. That leaves us with the scenario of the men in grey suits going in and asking him to step down. I don't think he would accept any invitation to step down from them if he got it, and I don't think we're going to see renewed pressure for a Tory leadership. Well, this was a result that will have been discounted in Tory circles.
Discounted even on the basis of being the biggest swing from Conservative to Labour this century in a by-election.
Because almost every result we see now in by-elections sets new records, and I think people are less astonished by the records now than we were a year or 2 back.
Overexcited by Peter Snow, I expect.
I've seldom been more excited, but the extraordinary thing about this is Mr. Major isn't going to like this. Our computer didn't like it either. It got so excited, our computer, that it simply failed to cope. Its brain, massive though it is, failed to cope. So let's open the doors and see what happens. And I'm a little nervous about this. You notice how slowly the doors are opening. This is because this extraordinary swing has got our computer calculating massive changes in the House of Commons from the present situation in which the Tories have a majority, as you know. Now, let's first of all visit the opposition benches, and I'll explain to you what actually happened when we first fed the figures for the changes in Dudley into all the seats in Parliament at the moment. what happened because he blew the computer up. But first of all, let's just look and see who's on the opposition benches. Not Tony Blair, I can tell you that for certain. Paddy Ashdown, 18 Liberal Democrat MPs. Now, who else is on the opposition benches? Could it be? Could it be? Could it be? Could it be? Yes, Mr. Major, with just one member of Parliament forecast in the result in this switch of all the votes in all the parliamentary seats in accordance with Dudley. But let me let you into a secret. When we first fed the figures into our computer, because actually on that swing Mr. Major would end up with no MPs, we had to put the one in to make the computer work. In fact, that should be 0. There would be no Conservatives in the House of Commons. There are the 25 others. Now, very slowly again, because we're working very hard to accommodate this change, 326 is the magic figure Tony Blair needs to win an overall majority. Will he make it? Don't all shout at once. Here we are over on the government benches then. Tony Blair's picture will pop up there and we'll see all the red figures representing Labour MPs heading for the winning post, the 326, the magic figure you need for an overall majority. And yes, coming up to it, just through it, decisively through it, very decisively through it, with 607 MPs on the changes in Dudley. And again, let's just move as quickly as we can around to see how the government and opposition line up altogether when you total them up. There you have an opposition figure of just 44, just one over here, which shouldn't really be here at all. It should be 43. Government 607. It would be a Labour majority of 563.
Well, John Prescott, that would be a very difficult Labour Party to run, wouldn't it?
Yes.
There'd be split after split there.
It'd be very good. I think it's a remarkable result, and we're, of course, going to be very, very happy tonight with that particular result. And it just identifies the trend that's been going on for a long time. And what is interesting, the result tonight confirms the polls, doesn't it? Pretty well exactly that were carried out in that constituency. And that's very interesting indeed, and I think it is a marked shift and change. And it has showed, in fact, that they've lost trust in this government, and they are seeing that the Labour is the alternative, and that's got to be welcomed by ourselves.
Stephen Dorrell, is there anything particular you think they should do? I mean, can you still have a Conservative Party chairman who says that, goes around making sort of gaffe after gaffe and saying victory is idle speculation? Yeah. Or does he have to go? Somebody must be sacrificed after tonight, knowing the Tory party, mustn't it? Somebody will be sacrificed.
No, David, that's exactly the way that a political party should not react to this kind of
let's
circumstance.
Keep that chairman.
Those graphics from Peter Snow, well, they're great fun. We've seen them before. I've read in the 1980s, after various by-election defeats, that we were going to be reduced to 1 in the next House of Commons, and we won with a majority of over 100. I don't think that's serious. What is serious is to ensure that the Tory party looks at the causes of its unpopularity, its failure to secure the support of its own natural constituency in Dudley West. I said at the beginning of the programme, I think that's partly down to natural midterm blues. I think that's been substantially enhanced by the political difficulties we've run into in the second half of this year, notably recently on VAT in Europe. And I think it's also partly the honeymoon effect with Mr. Blair. All those things have worked to make this an extremely difficult by-election for us. What we need to do as we look forward into '95 is to address those problems and move our attention and the attention of the electorate onto the need for sustainable economic recovery, improving living standards, improvements in the health service, improvements in education, which are the day-to-day business that are being delivered by this government.
All right, well, let's hear it from the horse's mouth. We're joined by Graham Postles. Thank you very much for coming to our cameras, Mr. Postles. Must have been a pretty shattering defeat for you and the Conservatives in Dudley West, a record swing against you. But you've been treading the streets. People have been praising your candidacy all the time. What message do you bring to the Conservative Party about what went wrong in Dudley West and what can be done to improve things?
Well, first of all, I bring a message which says that the Labour Party in this by-election has failed to even secure the vote it secured in the 1992 general election. And clearly what we've seen today is that we've had an awful lot of Conservative voters who have not felt sufficiently motivated to come out and support us. We fought the campaign on a very positive agenda. We sought to draw a distinction which was fairly easy, because whilst we had policies which were appealing to people on law and order, improvements in the health service, and a whole range of important issues that people were raising on the doorsteps, all we got from our Labour opponents was a policy vacuum. They simply had no message for the people of Dudley West. and clearly it's reflected in the fact that they haven't got even their core vote out, and it shows that we have a lot of work to do to ensure that we continue to aggressively put across our message to our supporters here and across the country to ensure that when the next general election comes, they are motivated to come out and support.
Even if that analysis were true, you're saying that 27,000 Tory voters stayed at home today. None of them went and voted Labour. They all stayed at home. You must have done something pretty devastating to get 27,000 voters, I see you're grinning at it, I'm not surprised, to stay at home out of the 34,000 who voted Tory at the last election.
Where we actually went out onto the doorsteps, and obviously a by-election, as you know, is a short period of time, it's about 3 weeks. We met many thousands of people, and when we put across the positive case we were putting across, where the national issues were expressed in local terms in terms of the new hospital wards, the improvements in the waiting lists, the success of our grant-maintained schools, the new jobs that have come into Dudley West, we found a positive response. And I hope that my candidature motivated some of those people to come out and vote today. But clearly the basic issue is that the Labour Party hasn't even secured the vote it secured here in the general election in 1992.
We've got that point, and I understand why you keep making it, because it's about the only point you've got in your favour, because the truth is, surely, even Stephen Dorrell here admits it, that the government is in deep trouble at the moment, and that's why things have gone badly. What I'd like to hear from you, because I think it might help John Major at number 10, for instance, is to tell him, Kenneth Clarke perhaps, what it is that the government can do now to get the Tory vote back, to stop this kind of thing happening at a general election in a couple of years' time.
Well, it's nice to see you have Stephen Dorrell with me, and as he'll know, because he came here to support my candidature in this election, the people of Dudley West do have concerns, and we've been addressing them. But we do need to emphasise our policies and to clarify the effects that they're having. We need to demonstrate to people that, for example, law and order is an issue where we take a much stronger line than our opponents. What this by-election, I think, has done is it's really started to emphasise the significant difference between ourselves and the Labour Party, in that whilst we are putting forward policies, they are shadowboxing and hiding behind cosmetic exercises that nobody's really fooled by.
Did you pick up disaffection with the Tory leadership? I mean, I certainly heard that from Tories who were going to vote Labour, that they were fed up with John Major. They thought he was a ditherer. They actually preferred Mrs Thatcher. I don't suppose they're going to get her back.
We saw 8 Conservative, or supposedly former Conservative voters with Tony Blair only a couple of days ago in this constituency, and they couldn't actually come up with one positive reason why they should actually vote Labour. And indeed, my Labour opponent in one of his press conferences earlier this week was asked directly to name 3 reasons why people should vote Labour today. He couldn't name one. And I think that is the message that has clearly come out of this by-election. We have a lot of work to do to ensure that our supporters understand our policies and see the positive results that they are producing in the areas that really concern them, like law and order, like jobs, like the health service.
All right. So you're going to be there for a return match when the general election comes?
Well, obviously that's in the hands of the constituency party, and of course, as you're probably aware, the seat is actually abolished in the Boundary Commission review. But there will be a Dudley North and a Dudley South, and obviously I shall probably be putting my hat into the ring when that happens.
Graham Postles, thanks very much indeed.
That's a pleasure.
Well, building on what he said about the reason that people voted the way they did, we've had a team out and about in Dudley today, this very day, asking the voters as they left the polling booths the reasons behind their choice. Let's hear first from long-standing Tories who defected to Labour today.
I haven't voted Labour in 30 years. We've always voted Conservative, but this time we've had enough. The state of the country, particularly the Midlands, is dreadful.
What is the particular problem?
Well, it's the economy. Some people are getting very rich and the rest of us are just getting worse off and worse off all the time.
I think the present government's made a real hash, you know, and it is time for a change. They've got so used to being in government that I think they're getting a bit blasé, aren't they?
The record between themselves is absolutely disgraceful, isn't it? If they can't agree between themselves, how can they agree on a policy?
Well, I think there's too much infighting. They've got 1 or 2 very strong characters, and I think they're more concerned about getting to the top of the Tory party than looking after the people who put them there.
They seem to have hit all the pensioners. They still hit them now. I mean, I have a cigarette and I enjoy a drink and I drive a car, so they've hit me in every direction.
This government at the moment, as I say, I've always voted them previously. They've closed everything down. They're quite willing to pay unemployment pay, where for a fraction of it, they could have actually subsidised some of the industry to keep them going till things are better and keep the employment up. To me, they're crackers.
So a fairly wide range of disaffection, Stephen Dorrell, including arguing, infighting, blasé about the voters?
Yeah, I don't accept we're blasé about the voters. I certainly obviously accept, I have accepted several times in the course of the programme, that arguments within the party are not going to strengthen our electoral position. If some of our own colleagues don't agree with the line we're taking, it's quite hard for us to persuade the wider electorate to agree with it.
Well, how do you persuade your own colleagues?
Well,
I mean, that's, as you say, the most important job.
I don't think it's the most important. I listed it as one of the things we have to deal with. There will always, in any political party, be differences. If a political party is to win the voters' trust, it has to demonstrate that it can reconcile those differences.
But this disagreement in the party, these disagreements are destroying the party, aren't they? What do you say to the people the ones who haven't got the whip, for instance, now, the people who are already, according to tomorrow's Times, major urge to retreat in a new rebellion by the Tories? I mean, their stories are likely to go on, aren't they now, in this current mood of sort of irritation and disaffection?
Yeah, I've only read the front page of the Times. That looks like, to me, as an argument that will go on in a political party at any time as part of routine business, and it's part of the function of party management to reconcile those differences. Well, the remaining issue that everyone knows there is an argument going on within the party about is the future course of our European policy. That is something we have to sort out and put straight if we're to secure public trust. Maybe impossible.
Maybe impossible to do.
I must say it's also, of course, a difference that exists quite as deeply in actually broadly the same proportions within the Labour Party. There's nothing unique to the Tory party.
Except that you're in government, and it shows.
It's perfectly true to say that a government with a small majority is more at risk when it encounters difficulty with its own backbenchers than a government with a big majority or an opposition. But if you look at the stance that the Conservative Party takes, the stance that the Labour Party takes, on European questions, neither party is fully united.
But since you are in government, and as you have been in power for 15 years, if it's not John Major's fault, if it's not a matter of the leadership, but actually deep-rooted divisions in the party, may you not have become ungovernable as a party and therefore unfit to govern?
No, I don't think there's any evidence of that. What we clearly need to do is to reconcile the party on European questions and then move on to actually the questions that the electorate at the end of the day care more about, because none of those voters emerging from that polling station mentioned Europe. They did talk about disarray, and then they went on to talk about pensions policy, the economy, about the health service. Those are the issues that at the end of the day will determine which way people vote in a general election, and on all of those issues, the Conservative government has a good story to tell.
You want to come in, Robin?
Well, I'd like to ask Stephen Dorrell whether he thinks the Conservatives have lost their old traditions of loyalty by being turned into an ideological party through the Thatcher years, and are you ever now going to be able to get out of this vortex of decline, it seems to be, because more and more of your backbenchers are looking at the position you are in the polls, looking at these kind of by-election results, more and more seem to be inclined to say, well, I'm going to be able to save my own skin better by taking a populist line, not supporting the government on unpopular things, or because I now have this particular ideology on Europe or some other question, I'm not going to stick with them, I'm going to do my own thing. The more they do their own thing, the more disunited you look, the worse your position in the polls. How do you get out of that vicious circle?
I've never accepted the argument that the Tory party changed its nature in any significant degree during the 1980s. I think that there always have been differences. There were differences between Wellington and Canning nearly 200 years ago. There are differences in any political party. We even occasionally hear a smidgen of disagreement between Mr. Prescott and his leader. All political parties have a number of different points of view within them. What they have to do is to reconcile those differences. What's never true of a political party is that a candidate of that party is better able to save his skin if the party is disunited.
But loyalty used to be the secret weapon.
Peter Kellner.
It will be again.
I have to say, it honestly doesn't seem to me that Stephen Dorrell is facing up to the scale of the crisis facing his party. We're looking at something way beyond normal mid-term blues. In this year's local elections, the story was of the most unpopular government this century. In the European elections, the story was of the most unpopular government this century. In the opinion polls, the story is the most unpopular government this century. In the 4 by-elections that you've been defending in this Parliament, the story has been of the most unpopular government this century. You have a party which is losing membership, it's losing money from traditional financial backers, it runs hardly any significant local councils, and tonight in a local by-election in Hampshire you lost another council, in East Hampshire District Council. It seems to me that you really are staring into an abyss quite unlike the kind of abyss or crisis that either you faced in the 80s or Labour faced in 1977 or the Conservatives faced in the early 60s at the time of Orpington. This is a qualitatively different scale of problem.
The problem with that argument, Peter, is that you are an arch exponent of the proposition that you have to look at numbers to understand what's happening in public opinion. And the figures that were presented by Peter Snow in the early part of this programme showed present level of support on best opinion poll evidence running at 26% now. That compares with 27%, hardly a statistically significant difference, in January of 1982, and 30% at the time of Weston. Now, none of those circumstances were comfortable circumstances for the Tory party. It is not my case that we have no difficulties and everything will come right naturally. Of course, that is nonsense. But it is not true to say that this is fundamentally different
all right,
from there.
let me bring in Nick Harvey on this. Now, what's the message for the Liberal Democrats in all this? Nobody on that film was talking about the Liberal Democrats. Everybody was just talking about switching to Labour. It's not, I mean, you're sort of left out of this tonight in a way because you came bottom of the poll, because apart from Paddy Ashdown saying you'd squeeze the Tories out, nobody expected you to do very well. But it actually isn't a very good result for the Liberal Democrats, is it? It's a dangerous result. If all the things that the voters are saying are true, that Labour is becoming electable, it means Liberal Democrats are no longer necessary as a way of protesting at the Tories.
Let's face it, Dudley West is not a seat that's high on our list of targets or that we would be seeking to win at a general election. And the evidence of the Parliament so far on the 4 by-elections that the Tories have been defending is that where the Liberal Democrats have been seen to be in second place in the challenges, it's we who have done well, and tonight Labour have had their night because they were in second place and they were seen to do well. And I think that the evidence from the current opinion polls, which Peter Snow was analysing earlier, and from tonight's result, is that the Liberal Democrats, in the seats where we are poised in second place, will do well from a swing against the government. And I don't think we've anything particularly to worry about from tonight's results. I think if we hold our nerve and campaign on our policies in our strong areas, we're going to do perfectly well.
Stephen Richards in Dudley West, let's just hear from you what the effect has been up there on the people you've been meeting right through the campaign of this result.
Well, I think the result is very much in line with what most people expected, to be honest. The Conservatives never had a chance here from the word go, and I doubt very much if the campaign for the Conservatives or the higher-profile Labour campaign made much difference at all. There is deep discontent in this area with the Conservatives. You found that on every high street and every doorstep. People saying we voted for the Conservatives in 1992 and are not going to do so again. Now, we know that people say that and don't always carry out such a threat, but they're feeling strong disillusionment with the Conservatives, and that's what we saw today. It was there at the beginning of the campaign. To say the campaign didn't make much difference, and it will take a long time, I suspect, for the Conservatives to woo these voters back. It was much about a move against the government as a move towards Labour.
Steve, thanks very much. Let's just, as a kind of consolation prize for you, Stephen Dorrell, go back to the people who voted today, and we also talked to a rather admittedly smaller group of Tories who stayed faithful to the party, and explain why.
There's only one way to vote. That's Conservative.
Why?
Well, what have they done with the economy? They've kept it stable, and that, to me, is very, very important.
I am an admirer of John Major, and I agree with their policies, especially on Northern Ireland. And I just don't feel, as a young person, being brought up under a Labour government, especially Harold Wilson, that I just can't feel safe with a Labour government again.
They're the best party. The other party doesn't have, you know, all they do is nitpick. They don't have any policies of their own.
Can you just tell us why you voted Conservative?
Because I am a Conservative.
And you're happy with the present government?
I think it could be improved, but I don't think anybody else has got a better answer.
So what do you think of Tony Blair's Labour Party?
Not a lot.
So, we haven't won them all, John.
No, they clearly represent the 7,000 votes that they got tonight. There are people who still believe in the Tory party. But, you know, it can't simply be put down to ignoring the evidence, as Stephen Dorrell is. Let me just call in aid the Vice Chairman, Mr Maples, on the electorate, because that was what was reflected on what they said on the television. What we are saying is that odds with their experience, which leads them to conclude that we are out of touch, lying, don't care, and think we are stupid. In other words, they're not trusted. That's the own Tory party Vice Chairman giving his report to the Prime Minister. And I think what we're now witnessing is further divisions coming in the Tory party in Europe. We've got the Nolan inquiry going to come to remind us of the sleaze that they've been involved in. There's the Scott inquiry about the Iraq gate. In the next 12 months, we're going to see more and more of division inside the Tory parties, reminding the electorate of this. And frankly, that means another nail in the coffin. And just remember that the mid-staffs one was 21% swing, I think, to Labour. This is another big swing against them, and that got rid of Thatcher, and I think the nail must be in the coffin of Major.
And unless, of course, it's such a shock that the party pulls itself together and reunites.
I think it's gone beyond that, quite frankly. They might reunite, but the people are fed up with this. They've run out of ideas, they're out of time, and they want to be put out, and Labour's gone about to do it.
Right, well, let's just have a look, a reminder at the result today, or tonight, of Dudley West. Labour victory, 28,400 for Ian Pearson, majority of 20,694 over the Conservatives, 776. The biggest swing at 29%, apart from one erratic by-election this century. There's the share of the vote. Labour on 69%, the Conservatives down on 19%, Liberal Democrats on 8%, and others on 5%. And the change from 92, Labour up 28, Liberal Democrats down 3, Conservatives down 30, the others up 5. So that's the scale of the swing, 28 up for Labour, 30% down for the Conservatives. Dudley West, Labour victory. Tony Blair has, from his office rather, from a jubilant office, we've just had this message, I quote, "The people of Dudley West have spoken for the people of Britain. They've spoken out in favour of the new Labour Party and against the old Tory Party. We must build on this success. We have a strategy and we have a mission. The strategy involves renewing our party to regain the people's trust. The mission is to renew our country." So that's Tony Blair's reaction to all that. Well, there'll be a lot more of this in the morning. Breakfast time, among other places, we'll be discussing it. From all of us here, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, and good night.